On the 24th of January 1712, a son was born to the Crown Prince of Prussia, Frederick William, and his wife, Sophia of Hanover, in the Prussian capital of Berlin. The newborn prince, named Frederick, belonged to the House of Hohenzollern, an ancient dynasty that stretched back to the 11th century. His grandfather, Frederick I, had made himself king in Prussia in 1701. He had previously been both the Elector of Brandenburg and the Duke of Prussia. The two were then later unified into the Kingdom of Prussia. The centre of Europe had been for nearly 1,000 years made up of a collection of smaller kingdoms, states and city-states that together formed the Holy Roman Empire. An emperor or empress would then be elected to rule over the empire, and more often than not, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Holy Roman Emperor or Empress came from the strongest German-speaking kingdom, Austria. Prussia was a relatively unremarkable state, with no natural resources and was considered unimportant, and so it was into this North German backwater that the young Prince Frederick was born. In 1713, King Frederick I died, making his son, William Frederick, king in Prussia. A highly capable ruler, William Frederick started the process of reorganising his country and its military. He did this because Prussia was geographically in a vulnerable position, lying in the middle of larger powers such as France, Russia, Sweden and Austria. William Frederick recognised this vulnerability and saw the necessity of building up the country's armed forces and economy, so it could, at the very least, defend itself in future wars. Being a small kingdom, Prussia could not compete with its neighbours in terms of raw numbers or manpower. William Frederick addressed this by ensuring that his armies were as well trained and disciplined as possible. He then brought in the canton system from 1733 onwards, under which the country was divided into districts, all of which had to provide a regiment to the army. All males that could serve in the army had to do so, meaning that before long Prussia had the fourth largest military machine in Europe. Strict training and drill were also brought in, meaning that by the end of William Frederick's reign, he had created the most efficient and well-trained army on the continent, an inheritance that his son would benefit from massively. However, King William Frederick and his son did not get on. The king wanted his son to adopt and carry on his military ethos, but young Prince Frederick was far more interested in learning the arts of peace, such as literature, philosophy and music. Frederick also started to read Latin and French, which his father forbid him to do, so the young prince was then forced to read foreign books at night in his bedchamber. Over time, Frederick began a double life. On one hand, he had to be seen to conform to his father's grueling military demands, but behind closed doors he would indulge in his real passion for learning. This double existence would years later result in Frederick being able to command his father's highly professional armed forces, but also oversee a transformation of Prussia's culture and governance to such a high degree that no other monarch in Europe at the time could match. However, King William Frederick began to be increasingly impatient and abusive towards his son, often cuffing or slapping him in public, much to the Crown Prince's humiliation. This only served, however, to increase the gap between father and son, and also make the young prince less likely to listen to his father or adopt his ideas. Then, in 1730, the king blocked the Crown Prince's marriage to an English princess, fearing a rift between Prussia and its overlords Austria, who had advised him not to allow the union. For the 18-year-old Frederick, this was the final straw, and he then came up with a plan to flee the country to England. This was an act of treason, and Frederick's attempted escape ended in failure. He was then captured and taken back to Prussia. The king then had the Crown Prince thrown into jail for 2 months in the Prussian fortress of Küstrin. Frederick honestly believed that his father was going to have him executed, but after the king discovered that Frederick had been aided in his escape by a friend of his, Hans Hermann von Katter, the king directed his fury at him instead, and von Katter was subsequently sentenced to death. Frederick was then pinned to the window of his cell by two servants and forced to watch his best friend being beheaded. This undoubtedly hurt Frederick massively, but in the following years he largely accepted his father's demands for him to fulfill his royal obligations and agreed to a marriage of an Austrian-approved princess, Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick. Austria's influence over Frederick's life and the pain it had caused him during this time would come back to bite them in the future, as when he became King Frederick, he made securing political independence from Austria and the Holy Roman Empire his #1 objective. Frederick and his new bride did not have a close or intimate marriage, and he was a distant and sometimes insulting husband to Elizabeth, possibly as the marriage had been arranged by his father and his Austrian overlords. He did, however, stay with Elizabeth all his life, taking no mistresses, and looked after her, at least financially, during his reign, although the two lived apart and did not have any children. Then, in May 1740, King William Frederick died. He had, without a doubt, been an efficient and effective monarch, and had done much to strengthen Prussia's military, but the kingdom was still divided into separate island states such as East Prussia and Cleves in the west, and also was still under the heel of the Austrians to the south. So it was upon these strong, yet still vulnerable foundations that young King Frederick would build a German regional power that would, over the coming decades and centuries, change the history of Europe and the world as a whole. Now that he was king in Prussia, Frederick sought to unify his scattered kingdom and also determined to gain total independence from the Holy Roman Empire and Austrian influence. In October 1740, the Holy Roman Emperor and Archduke of Austria, Charles VI, died, handing his lands to his daughter, Maria Theresa. King Frederick then refused to recognise the Grand Duchess's territorial inheritance and set his sights on Silesia, which was at the time the breadbasket of Central Europe and Austria's most valuable province. He then assembled 27,000 troops on the banks of the River Oder and marched them southeast from Prussia in a bold move to claim Silesia for himself. In less than 6 weeks, the province was under Prussian control, and Frederick and his army settled down for the winter. But Archduchess Maria Theresa had no intention of surrendering Silesia without a fight, and in the spring of 1741 she sent an Austrian army to retake the province. The two forces then met on the 10th of April 1741 in the Battle of Mollwitz, and the confrontation would prove pivotal into teaching the young Prussian king valuable lessons in warfare. During the battle, the 20,000 strong Austrian army attacked the Prussian right wing with a 4,500 strong cavalry force, routing the Prussian cavalry in turn. Then, Frederick's second-in-command, Kurt Christoph Graf von Schwerin, advised the king to flee the field in case of a Prussian rout, but the Prussians were saved largely thanks to their infantry's training and rate of fire, which was 4, sometimes 5 shots a minute, in comparison with their enemy being able to fire 2 to 3 shots a minute. And after a prolonged exchange of volleys and fire, the Austrians buckled under the pressure and fled the field. After the battle, Frederick swore that he would never again leave his troops whilst fighting, and stayed true to his word until his death. He stated afterwards that the Battle of Mollwitz was his school, and his army's near defeat in the battle taught him valuable lessons in how to command troops, and also how warfare should be undertaken in general. In August 1741, France and Bavaria also declared war on Austria in an attempt to claim the Kingdom of Bohemia, forcing the Austrians to withdraw valuable troops and sending them west to meet the new threat. This ensured that Silesia remained in Prussian hands for the time being at least. Frederick had gambled in invading the province, and thanks to the expert help of his generals, along with his highly trained officers and troops, he had claimed victory. He knew that in some respects he had been lucky, and resolved to master the art of warfare as much as he could to try and restrict the element of luck in his future battles. His armies then marched into Bohemia in a combined offensive with the French and their allies in order to further carry the fight to the Austrians and hopefully secure more territory. This resulted in the Austrians sending a 30,000 strong army commanded by Prince Charles Alexander of Lorraine, who was Maria Theresa's brother-in-law, to relieve the occupied Bohemian capital of Prague and kick Austria's enemies out of the kingdom. The two sides then met at the Battle of Chott-Usitz on the 17th of May 1742. Once again, the Prussian cavalry proved to be inferior to their Austrian counterparts. Instead, the Prussian infantry was the determining factor in the battle, which resulted in another victory for Frederick. Frederick's father had neglected the training of Prussian cavalry during his reign, and after the Battle of Chott-Usitz, Frederick started to retrain his cavalry, making it, before long, one of the most effective cavalry forces in the whole of Europe. The successive defeats to Prussia then forced the Austrians to sign the peace treaty of Breslau in 1742, which effectively meant that Silesia was now in Prussian hands, and that Frederick had in turn almost doubled his territory in the War of the Austrian Succession, or the First Silesian War as it is sometimes known. In 1743, the Austrians were at war with the French and the Bavarians over the control of Bohemia, and hoping to capitalise on Austrians' perceived weakness, Frederick renewed his alliance with the French and Bavarians and invaded Bohemia himself in support of them in August 1744. He advanced in 3 separate armies through Silesia and Saxony with the agreement of the Elector of Saxony, Augustus III, who was also King of Poland and Lithuania. The Allies planned to attack the Austrians on 2 fronts, the French and Bavarians from the west and the Prussians from the north, but in retaliation Austria agreed an alliance with Britain, the Dutch Republic and Saxony. Augustus III of Saxony then changed sides after letting the Prussians pass through his territory, basically cutting them off from their homeland. With Saxony now lying between himself and Prussia, Frederick was in a precarious position. He decided to withdraw from Bohemia altogether, meaning that the Austrians were now free to take care of the French and the Bavarians without Prussian support. This resulted in the Austrians defeating the Franco-Bavarian armies at the Battle of Pfaffenhofen in April 1745. This in essence knocked Prussia's allies out of the war, and now meant that the Austrians and Saxons only had to deal with Frederick's Prussia. The two allies then formed a single large army and marched into Silesia in hope of defeating Frederick's armies for good and dividing Prussia up between them. Frederick, however, had had time to prepare his defences and was lying in wait for the Austro-Bavarian assault. The two forces then met around the town of Hohenfriedberg, which is now Dobromir in modern-day Poland. The Prussian and Frederick's battle plan was to first attack the Saxons and defeat them, then take on the Austrians. They started their offensive on the morning of the 4th of June 1745, whilst the Saxons were still in camp. Taken by surprise, the Saxon forces were soon overwhelmed and surrendered. Frederick's army then turned its attention to the Austrians, who were now outnumbered. The newly retrained Prussian cavalry and dragoons now played a pivotal role in the battle. They attacked the left wing of the Austrian army, rolling up their line in the process until the bulk of the Austrian forces were in headlong retreat. The elite Prussian infantry then pushed forward, further forcing the Austrians to give way, until by evening the battlefield belonged to Prussia. Frederick had hoped that by repeatedly defeating the Austrians, it would bring them to the negotiating table, but they were determined to destroy Prussia as a state, as it posed the greatest threat to Austrian control over Germany and Central Europe as a whole. The Austrians and their Saxon allies then regrouped and decided to attack Frederick and Prussia on their own soil by marching north into Brandenburg in the hope of seizing Berlin and ending the war in their favour. Frederick, however, received intelligence of his enemy's movements and left Silesia in order to ready his defences. This culminated in the Prussians once again engaging and defeating the Austro-Saxon armies in the Battle of Hennersdorf and Kesseldorf in the winter of 1745, ending Austria's hopes of destroying Prussian power and again ending their hopes of regaining control of Silesia. Austria and its allies then signed the Treaty of Dresden on Christmas Day 1745, effectively ending the Second Silesian War. Frederick II's Prussia was now the preeminent state within Germany and a new and formidable power on the map of Europe. The Silesian Wars and Frederick's victories can be put down to various factors. He had inherited from his father arguably the best organised and efficient army in Europe, as well as a highly trained and intelligent officer corps, who he felt comfortable in delegating decision making to. There is no doubt, however, that Frederick possessed great strategic intelligence and was able to look at a campaign or war and foresee his enemy's movements and risks. He was bold, cunning and supremely intelligent in his strategic choices, and also looked to take the initiative against his enemies, meaning he had greater control over events. Although it should be said that he did make some mistakes early in his military campaigns, and was lucky in some ways to emerge victorious from them, he was a quick learner and also had the ability to listen to his advisors and subordinates and allow them the freedom to make decisions for themselves during campaigns and battles. If Frederick had lost any of the battles during the Silesian Wars, it is highly likely that he would have lost all the territorial gains he had made so far, and very possibly his kingdom and throne full stop. This demonstrates how intelligent Frederick was, and how well organised the Prussian war machine had become through necessity, because of Prussia being weaker in manpower and resources than its rivals and neighbours. In little more than 5 years since succeeding his father, Frederick had nearly doubled the size of the Prussian kingdom and placed the country on the power map of Europe. He and his subjects were now rewarded with over a decade of peace and prosperity, in which he undertook a further transformation and reorganisation of the Prussian state, both in terms of economy and its governance. He then built the Palace of Sanssouci in Potsdam near Berlin from 1745 to 1747. The palace was not inspired by the plain, almost minimalistic Prussian style of earlier palaces, rather taking its inspiration from the more ornate palaces of Western Europe, and in particular France. Frederick was a lover of all things French, speaking the language fluently, much to his late father's annoyance, and being heavily influenced by French philosophers such as Voltaire, who even came to live with Frederick at his new palace for 3 years. Frederick had also become an extremely competent and gifted composer, and in particular becoming an excellent flute player. His compositions are still regarded today as being of a very, very high quality, which only extremely skilled flute players can perform. The palace at Sanssouci, in many ways, was Frederick expressing his artistic dreams and making them reality. He had proven himself to be a great military commander, fulfilling and exceeding his father's ambitions for him, and now he sought to transform Prussia and turn it into a reflection of his own image as an advanced, forward-thinking state at the forefront of science, culture, and military power in Europe. The peace was not to last, however, as in 1746 Frederick's arch-enemy, Maria Theresa of Austria, had signed a defensive alliance with the Tsaritsa of Russia, Elizabeth I. Maria Theresa could not let go or forget Frederick's victories over her, and immediately after the Second Silesian War, she set about rebuilding her armies and forming new alliances against Frederick and his newly established upstart state. The British had been drawn into an alliance with the Austrians and Russians, pledging financial support to them. Frederick then sought to ally himself with the British to avoid encirclement, and succeeded when the two countries formed the Convention of Westminster in 1756, forming the Anglo-Prussian alliance. This strategy backfired spectacularly, however, as the French were incensed by Frederick allying himself with Britain, and they in turn allied themselves with Austria and Russia. Britain was soon at war with France in what was to become known as the 7 Years' War in North America and around the world, and Frederick was now confronted with having to fight the French, the Austrians, the Saxons and the Russians all at the same time, a daunting if not impossible task. The coming war would be a fight for survival for both Prussia and Frederick himself. The forces rallied against him were immense, and he would need all of his intelligence, skill and courage to overcome the obstacles which lay ahead.